Good evening. We are beginning continuing our study of the book of Esther tonight as we continue to look through Hebrew History 3 as well as Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. This course was supposed to be in two separate courses. However, as I've looked at it and taught it in times past, I think that we need to tie the history of the books, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, in with the prophecies, so that we can understand what's being said and why we're saying it. Now, we have over the last few weeks, we have looked through Ezra. We have seen the rebuilding of the temple. We have talked about the idea of Haggai and Zechariah as they preach to motivate to the people to be faithful to God and to fulfill the commission that God had given them in rebuilding the temple. We've spent a lot of time talking about the temple. We've spent a lot of time talking about why God wanted the temple to be rebuilt. We have spent a great deal of time in the book of Zechariah talking about the messianic references in light of the temple that Jesus was going to establish, which is, from what we read and understand, the body, the church of Christ. So we've come from that. We have gotten down to Ezekiel chapter 6 and 7, Ezra chapter 6 and 7, where we read about the situation of them completing the temple, rejoicing. Then in chapter 7, Ezra actually comes on the scene and begins his preaching work and does what he can to bring the people back to God. Between chapter 6 and 7 of the book of Ezra, we find the events taking place of Esther. And this is what we studied about last week. We're not going to go over through all of that material again because we did cover that last week in 2 hours. But the reality is this book is and does tell us the emphasis upon God's providence. It's one of those books that's named after a woman in Scripture, but it's a book also that does not name the name of God. And yet, at the same time, we understand that God is all the way of this. He is hand and providence of taking care of his people, the church, or the Jews, so as to bring Christ into the world, is all through this in every sense of the term. We have keyed in on the idea of Esther chapter 1, what happened with that. We talked about the historical background with Xerxes and what he had done in trying to defeat the Greeks. We understand that probably, and again, I stress that idea because there are some commentators out there that suggest the idea that this wasn't a great deal of time between chapter 1 and 2, but as I look at it and as I see it myself, there was the situation where Vashti, chapter 1, Xerxes is getting all of his forces together. Vashti refuses to go in before Ahasuerus or Xerxes, and as a result of that, he deposes her. He then goes off to battle, comes back after being defeated by the Greeks, and then he wishes for his consort, his harem, and again, he's very upset about the way that whole thing plays out. We looked in Esther chapter 2, how the role of women at that time were not, and what the function of women were at that time was nothing like we understand it today with regards to women having equal rights. We understand that, and we mentioned the fact that it's Christianity that has brought or helped women to come up to a higher level, to an understanding that we are all one in Christ, Galatians chapter 3. However, we all have different roles and different functions to play. It's the problem of feminism today that emphasizes the idea that women should be able to do everything that men should do, even in the Lord's church. God, however, has specifically emphasized what the limits of those roles are. He not only did it with regards to the family, Ephesians chapter 5, but also with regards to the church, 1 Timothy chapter 2, beginning in verse 9 and going through verse 14. So we understand as we look at these passages of Scripture that God has set definite limits on the role of women and the role of men and what those roles ought to be. I am firmly convinced, thinking about it, that given the opportunity, men would step back out of the picture and allow the women to run everything, even the church, if they would allow. But God demands, God requires that men take the leadership role. And I think it is time for the men of the Lord's church to stand up and take that role and understand what that is, to do a better job in preparing young men for the work of an elder, for the work of preachers, for deacons, to be leaders in the church, as opposed to those that are just sitting there in the pew. So we spent a lot of time talking about that. We come on into chapter 2 and emphasize the idea, again, about the role of women and how they were just treated as property. Here you have a very promiscuous king getting all the virgins of the empire or that time to become a part of his harem. Think about how tragic all of this is in light of the world. And again, how God in all of this was orchestrating it, where Esther becomes the queen, where she is in the right time at the right place to do something whenever evil comes on the scene. I have made the argument, and I still make the argument very firmly, that every time where there's crucial moments in history, there are always those men that rise to the top, that become the leaders, that help to bring out and carry out God's will. And I use the reference regarding World War II and some of the events that was happening and taking place at that time. So here you have the same situation, and here it's not so much a man taking that leadership position as much as it is Esther, who is following the lead of her uncle, Mordecai, and bringing about the salvation of the Jews. As we look at this, again, God is orchestrating this whole thing. And I think as we teach the book of Esther, especially with Last Leaders Convention coming up this next year, dealing with the book of Esther, along with a couple of other books, the book of Job as well, we need to see, this thing where God is helping and uses women to orchestrate his will. God can use anybody if they're willing to be his servants. And I just appreciate that so much. We need to emphasize this to our young women, to grow up and be chaste, keepers at home, as Titus will talk about in Titus chapter 2, but also to emphasize the idea as we look at it and consider it in more detail, how they can make or break a man from becoming an elder, a deacon, a preacher, and the things that need to be done in the Lord's church. As we come to chapter 3, Esther has now become king. We come to the end of chapter 2, and Mordecai discovers a plot, and he overheard about two of King Ahasuerus' men making death threats against King Ahasuerus. And when it came to be found out, then, again, it was written in the Chronicles of the book of the king, as well as, think about this for just a few moments, a situation that we kind of see an aside, but later on is going to play in the rest of this as well. We come to Esther chapter 3, and we finally come to the explanation of Haman. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, so that the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. So here's the first situation we read about Haman here. Haman was obviously a man that had a great deal of influence with King Ahasuerus. You see that he advanced him and set him above all the other princes who were with him. Princes would suggest the idea perhaps his son, but I don't think it's his son. Notice also that he is the son of Hammedatha, the Agagites. Now, when you go back to this, Josephus in the book Antiquities of the Jews, book 11, chapter 6, paragraph 5, as he starts to talk about Haman, Josephus defines him as an Amalekite and a descendant of King Agag of the Amalekites. We remember back in 1 Samuel chapter 15 that Saul had been given a command by God to utterly destroy the Amalekites. And his failure to do so brought about Samuel's reproof of Saul and killing King Agag himself. If this was the same Agag, a descendant of King Agag, the Agagite as it was, then it may very well be the argument that Josephus makes that he is an Amalekite. If this is the case, this might also help us to see that if Haman had been taught about what happened in the time of Saul and how the children of Israel on numerous occasions had sought and destroyed the Amalekites on numerous occasions, this would have been even that much more of an opportunity for him, or more of a reason why he would want the Jews to be destroyed, because of the history of what had happened to the Amalekites before. So we really can't say for a fact that that's exactly what it is, nor can we say and argue beyond any shadow of a doubt that this is where his comes from, but it does say something along that line, and it may help us to understand why Haman is so bitter against the Jews. It wasn't just because of Mordecai. Mordecai, if he had wanted to, probably could have at any time Haman could have caused him to be put to death, and in fact was building up to that before the events of the rest of the book actually take place. It also emphasizes to us the kind of man that Haman is. He gets upset because all these other people are bowing down and honoring him and praising him, but Mordecai won't. So the king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, chapter 3 at verse 3, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And it happened when they spoke to him daily and he would not listen to them. Then they told that to Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. For Mordecai said that he was a Jew. He was obviously a devout Jew. He was a man that was not going to bow down before idols nor before men. However, at the same time, as we think about this in this respect, we do know that even though a person was a Jew, that they would have obeyed the authorities and the law of the land, because that's what God had always emphasized and commanded them. Mordecai refused to do so. And again, there may be some more reasons besides that, and besides him being just a Jew. So when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay him homage, he was filled with wrath. It may be that he had not even realized that Mordecai had not bowed down. It may be that the king's servants told him about that. They went and told it to Haman to see whether or not Mordecai's word would stand. So think about this. There's always people out there that are always going to be challenging us and our words and what we're going to do. Mordecai may very well have said, "I cannot fall down before him because I only fall down before the God of heaven and earth. He is the king." So they went and told Haman. Haman's going to do something about it. There's always the instigators of problems. They're always the ones that are instigating trouble, that like to see if a person is going to do what they said they were going to do or not. It's sad to say, but that's true even of the Lord's church. I hope that all of us would be honest enough that we would do what we said we would do with regards to what was said. I remember one time in a Bible college situation, there was one particular class that I was a part of that it dealt with preachers, and there was obviously some very big concerns that some of the preachers had with how they deal with the younger women in the congregation. We remember that Paul would tell the young preacher Timothy to keep himself pure, and especially with regards as he's dealing with the young sisters in the congregation, because it seems to suggest that Timothy was not married, and so he had to make sure that there would be no possibility of indiscretion or even the hint of indiscretion with anybody. So therefore, Paul warned Timothy. In this particular class, there's one brother seemed like he kept bringing it up, and in every class it seemed like this particular teacher continually talked about this idea of sex and how it's very dangerous for a young gospel preacher and how he needed to be aware of this. And it got to the point where it just seemed like that's all we were ever talking about. And I actually made the statement, if he says something about this one more time, I think I'm going to get up and walk out. And lo and behold, there was a brother there that brought it up again because he had overheard me said that. And he looked back at me to see whether or not I was going to get up or not. I did not. I regret that I did not. I had said I'd done it, and the bottom line is I should have lived up to what I said I was going to do. We all have those situations. We've all have those instigators. Here you've got these instigators that's egging the problem on. And so just realize they're there. And I just challenge us again, whenever we say we're going to do something, we better do it. As gospel preachers, as elders, as deacons, whatever it is, because we need to be men of our word. If somebody helps us to see maybe the error of our thinking, then maybe we can go back and say, okay, I didn't realize this, maybe I need to do this. But if we say we're going to do something, we need to do it. I never have forgotten that. And I hope and pray since that time that I have lived up to what I said I was going to do. And I've also tried to learn to watch what I say so I don't go too far in what I say I'm going to do. So Haman was filled with wrath, chapter 3 at verse 5. And as we continue to look at this whole situation, we see that he refused. He's a planner. He's one of those guys that he's not going to take immediate action. He's going to plan it out. And he's going to plan it out in such a way to where it's not only going to hurt Mordecai, but everybody that knows Mordecai. And it even goes so far, as we're going to see through the text, that it's going to apply then to the entire Jewish race. So he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. So here you have the hatred of one man going to an entire race. And again, before we sit back and say, how in the world can anything like that can happen? Think about, again, how the hatred of one man in the 1930s by the name of Adolf Hitler was against an entire race of people, that he was the instigator of the final solution and had his cohorts with him that agreed with that so much that they were doing everything they possibly could to exterminate the Jews before. What's always interesting to me is history, as I've often said, it repeats itself, even though it is linear and it's going to that final day when the Lord is going to come back. We understand that it is cyclical. So this idea where God wanted the Jews to be destroyed, where Haman wanted the Jews to be destroyed, we find it's, again, this history has been over and over and over again. Why is that? Obviously, the Jews were living, even though they were living peaceable lives in these countries, they were living different lives. They had learned from the sin of their forefathers not to engage with the people in the land, not to intermarry with the people in the land. So they did not do that. So as we think about it, we can't help but, again, realize that whenever we live a different life, when Christians really start living the kind of lives that God wants us to live, we too will be hated. And that's why you read in the first century that the first century church faced the problems that it faced because of the fact that they were living such different lives. Could it be that we do not deal with the persecution that the first century church had because we are not so different from the world? Paul would say, all that live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution, 2 Timothy chapter 3. Could it be that right now in our culture, in our society, that we're getting to that point where people can tell a difference? I just hope that we would live up to the calling wherewith we were called and truly be the different kind of people. Yes, it will mean persecution, but so be it. So here's his plan. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, and here he's going to the Jewish calendar, he said, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast Pur, that is the lot, before Haman to determine the day and the month until it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Now, even in the casting of the lot, and again, the best thing maybe we could compare it to is the rolling of the dice. In the casting of the lot, we even see God's hand in this, because it didn't happen that it was going to happen within the next 2 or 3 months. But this was in the first month, and then the lot showed up in the 12th month. God wanted to have time, or wanted the Jews to have time to do what needed to be done and get everything prepared for this event to take place. Remember, God has gotten Esther in the king's household. So again, as we're going to go on to chapter 4, we're going to see how Esther is going to be coming to the kingdom for such a time as this. But again, you see God's working all of this out. So Haman, after making this plan, he's got all of his ducks in a row. Another great lesson here is you've got to say something about Haman in the fact that he made the plans before he actually went forward and tried to do anything. So many times we don't do well with planning, and because we don't do well with planning, then the work suffers. Haman obviously spent some time planning how he was going to ask the king how to do this, trying to figure out the date that it was going to happen, because he was so sure that Ahasuerus would give him that permission to do just that. Ahasuerus is so perhaps now just kind of backing off from everything in the kingdom to the point to where he's giving all of his power, or delegating it to the point to where he's just letting some other people run it, and he is not doing what he needs to be doing as king. Listen to the argument that Haman made. Verse 8. There is a certain people scattered and dispersed through among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. Now, we stop here again, see the accusation. Number one, they're living by a different standard than we are. And that's always been the argument of the world. Christians are living by a different standard. We should not be ashamed of that. We should be proud of that and truly live by that to the very best of our ability. Second, he says their laws are different from everybody else, and they do not keep the king's laws. We remember the fact that when Jesus is going to be nailed to the cross, what was the accusation of the Jews at that time? He is living by a different standard. He's living by a different law. He's commanding that the law of Moses, which we have been saying, is going to be done away, and this temple is going to be destroyed. They make that accusation against Jesus, and then they turn around and they will say that Jesus had actually broke Roman law. You remember back in Matthew chapter 22, their argument is, should we pay tribute to Caesar or not? And the trap that they were getting him into was, if we say no, then we can get the Romans on him. If we say yes, then he's going to lose all of the influence he has with the Jewish people who hated to pay Roman taxes. And we remember Jesus' wisdom. Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. So, and then you think about the Apostle Paul, who was accused as well by the Jews, and they wanted to tear him apart, Acts 21, 22, and 23, because they felt like he was teaching that the Old Testament law was done away with. As you read through the New Testament, that's what he was teaching. But as we read Romans 14, 15, and other passages, we also understand and know in certain terms that Paul knew that it was going to be something that was going to be hard learned for the Jews. But he does make the point that we're living under that new covenant of Christ. So it was this accusation that they made against Paul. History repeats itself. Here again, you have these situations where people are going to make accusations against God's people simply because they're God's people, and they're going to try to make God's people look the worst they possibly can. So he says this: it's fitting that we don't let them remain. So what he's asking for, in essence, is an absolute genocide. If it pleases the king, let it be written that there be that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work to bring it into the king's treasury. Now, look what Haman is doing. Number one, he says, there's people scattered around all your provinces. They're this way. Number two, they're not following the king's law. They're following their own laws. And number three, if you allow me to do this, I will pay 10,000 talents of silver. That is a lot of money. If we think about what the price of silver is today, if we think that my understanding is of talent at that time weighed roughly 75 pounds. So if you take 10,000 talents, and multiply that 75,000 pounds of silver and multiply it by today's, what the price of silver is today, you kind of get the idea of how much money he was willing to pay to get these people destroyed. A king and a governor should, we're not living in the world today where it's happening, but they should sit down and think about how they're going to run their kingdom, and money is what runs the kingdom. So if you actually annihilate a race of people, as Haman is asking, Haman is telling them, number one, I'll pay for it. And number two, it's not going to hurt you as the king, because I'm going to put 10,000 talents of silver into the king's treasury, so you're not going to have to worry about any possible tax loss from this. So again, when you're looking at human life strictly from the bottom line of the bottom line, then obviously when a man made this kind of agreement, the king, and also think about this, if this was the time, as I argued in between chapter 1 and 2, this was after the destruction of the Persian armies by the Greeks, then Xerxes Ahasuerus would be looking for ways to put more money back into the budget of the kingdom to be able to do the things that he would want to do a little bit later on. So both of these things would have appealed to him, as we think about taxes appealing to politicians today. So rather than thinking this thing through, as far as we know, we do not read of any question the king asked or anything like this. So as far as we know about it, the king trusted Haman so much that he just took a signet ring and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And it says, the money and the people are given to you to do with them as seems good to you. So he gives the signet ring, which says this is the decree of the king. We remember, and we're going to see also the fact that when a decree of the king was made, especially during the time of the Persians, and I brought this out a little bit last week, but I just want to remind us that this was the first government, as far as we knew, that emphasized the idea that the king and everybody under it is amenable to the laws. So once this decree had been made, even the king could not break it. We see this emphasis again in Daniel chapter 6, with the situation with Daniel going to the lion's den, and what brought about that. Again, it was a decree made by the king that no one could pray to any god except him for a period of 30 days. He was trapped into it. Here's the same kind of situation going on. Haman trapped Ahasuerus into it. He didn't think things through, just as Daniel chapter 6, the king there did not think things through. So the king's scribes were called on the 13th day of the first month. A decree was written according to all that Haman commanded, to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, to the officials of all the people, every province according to its script, and every people in their language. In the name of King Ahasuerus, it was written and sealed with the king's signet ring. So once it was written, it could not be broken. It had to be done. And the letters were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces to destroy, now here it is, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, young and old, little children and women, on the 13th day of the 12th month. So we're going to be exactly 11 months to the day after the event take place, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. And again, think about it in this respect. If they plundered the Jews' possessions, that would have given them even more money to do what they needed to do in rebuilding the fortunes of the coffers of the king. Go back again. You don't have to go back that far, but in 1930, when they started the pogrom against the Jews with the Hitler, much of the Jewish goods, their gold, their silver, and everything like that, was taken from them and put into the treasury of Germany so as to finance the building of armaments, the building of the soldiers. All of this come by looting, by plundering the Jews. So this is not the first time that it happened. In 1930, here we see the same thing happening going on again back there in the Persian Empire. So then a copy of the document was to be issued as law in every province, being published for all people, that they should be ready for that day. The couriers went out, hastened by the king's command. The decree was proclaimed in Shushan, the citadel. And notice what happened. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. The Hebrew word says they were in confusion. And it wasn't just in Shushan, the citadel, it was throughout the entire Persian Empire that this was happening. So we go on from that. When Mordecai learned all that had happened, chapter 4, verse 1, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went as far as the front of the king's gate, because no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. Again, one of the commands was that you do not make the king unhappy. We're going to find this a little bit later on when we study the book of Nehemiah chapter 1 and chapter 2, when Nehemiah is giving the opportunity to go back and rebuild the walls of the city of Jerusalem. When he actually appears before the king, the Bible says that he had not appeared to him for a period of time, but when he does appear, he's sad, and the king says, "Why are you sad? This is nothing but sorrow of spirit." And the Bible would say that Nehemiah prayed, and then he then said to the king and made his request to go back at that time and rebuild the walls of the city of Jerusalem. He then becomes the governor and serves as a governor for 13 years. Goes back and then goes back again and serves as governor again, as we read about in Nehemiah chapter 13. You don't come before the king sad. You don't bum the king out. You come before the king with happiness, with joy, and you're doing your dead level best to please the king because he is the king. So he would not be allowed to go where he had been going to find out about what's going on with Esther. So in every province where the king's command and decree had arrived, there was a great mourning among the Jews, fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. As we read this, we're kind of shaking our heads, but I don't know that we really understand what they were feeling. In essence, again, they were calling for the annihilation of the Jews, just because of who they were. Some of the older people now can remember some of the events that took place around the Holocaust. And again, when you go back and you read and you listen to, and you can find some of this on some of the YouTube channels where they talk to Holocaust survivors, they will talk about the horror. They will talk about how terrible things were. Viktor Frankl, who was a psychiatrist, a German or a Jewish psychiatrist, was thrown into one of these concentration camps. He lived through it, and he wrote the book In Search of Meaning, with the idea of trying to find out. And he just tells his story about how these Jews would give up. How a lot of times, and he's talking more from the idea of the workers, how they would give up, how they had to fight to live, even in the concentration camps, and how that affected his way of looking at things in a psychiatric way. So you see, I don't know that we, as we're reading through the text, we're sitting there, and we know the rest of the story, because we know that the Jews were saved, but can we even begin to put ourselves in their shoes and understand what is going on? Again, it may happen to Christians before long, and again, are we willing to pay that price? So they're laying in sackcloth and ashes. Now, Esther is in the king's harem. She has whatever her heart desires. She has whatever she needs. The only thing she has to do is appear before the king whenever he requests her for her, and that's all there is to it. So Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, And the queen was deeply distressed, so she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept them. So this was something she obviously had to be very, very serious in this respect. So think about this. Esther called Haggai, one of the king's eunuchs, whom he had appointed to attend her, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai to learn why and what this was. So she didn't even have a clue that this had actually taken place. Again, a queen at that time, she would be secluded from everywhere else. You know, the only thing that she would find out about is by secondhand knowledge. She would not have her say in the king's affairs and what the king decided to do. She just found out by accident. Well, again, not necessarily by accident, but as she begins to find out what was going on with Mordecai. So he went out to Mordecai in the city gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews. And then again, you think about the plunder that they were hoping to get as well. He also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, so that Esther may sit back and she may, what do we do a lot of times when we hear something that we just can't believe? We just shake our head. No, that can't be the case. Here's the decree. Here's where it was signed. Here's the actual signature by Haman and with the king's signet ring. So there you have that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and he might command her to go into the king to make supplication to him and plead before him and for her people. For her people. So Haggai returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai. And Esther spoke to Haggai and gave him a command. And so Haggai is becoming, in essence, the go-between. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court of the king who has not been called, there's but one law. And again, this was the law of the Persians, so it could not be changed. Put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter. He said, I have not have been called to go into the king these 30 days. So 30 days, she had not seen him. That's part of the reason why she probably not heard about it. So they told Mordecai Esther's words. And then here is that one passage of scripture that we talked about last week that emphasizes to us, again, the idea that, or the one passage of scripture that we hear preached more than any other passage out of this. He said, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. If you remain completely silent, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for a time as this. What a powerful message in just a few short sentences. Number one, he tells her, just because you are a Jew and you're in the king's house does not mean that you will be spared. Something has to be done. The law could not be changed, even if it goes to the queen. So again, it emphasizes to us that this law could not be changed. Number two, it emphasizes to her, as you look at the second part of it, is that Mordecai believed that God would bring about the deliverance of the Jews from another means. So again, do you not see God's providence in all of this? Putting Esther in that place at that moment in time, putting Mordecai there to encourage that. She is, in essence, going to make a difference. There's one critical point in her life where her life is going to change forever, drastically. And she is fearful. She's fearful for her life. In my notes, I have this, and I really think this is very important. Courage involves standing up to fear and doing what needs to be done. It does not mean that fear is absent. Fear is there, but you still do what has to be done. John Wayne, in one of his movies, said this: courage is being scared to death, but saddling up anyway. And I've actually got that hanging on my wall in my office at my house. Courage is being scared to death, but saddling up anyway. There are times when preachers and elders have to do the right thing, and you're scared. You're fearful about how this sermon or this decision will be made and how it will be looked at by members of the congregation. All of these things come into play. All of this comes into play as we think about it. It means that a person is going to face fear in their lives, but courage means I'll face the fear, I'll do what's right no matter the cost. That is the challenge that we must give to the church today. I think in a lot of situations today, we in the church have become fearful. We're afraid of the community. Back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, there was a lot of teaching going on about the sin of denominationalism. And a lot of people at that time maybe came across as Christians. They came across as being know-it-alls and didn't always preach the truth in love. So then we started having people say in the 70s, in the 80s, and the 90s, look, we don't need to name names out of the pulpit. We don't need to actually call a denominational name because that's going to offend somebody. Well, now we have gotten to the point that we're so afraid of offending people that we don't teach the truth. We won't mention denominations from the pulpit anymore. Okay, but think about how this has gone on to other things. We won't preach the truth on marriage, divorce, and remarriage anymore because of how many people this is going to affect. Think about in a local congregation of the Lord's church, how many people have been divorced. And so we try not to preach on this because it's going to offend people. Think about the whole idea, you name a sin. Years ago, it was a sin to take a drink. Now, and perhaps we did some more study on that. Maybe that was an extreme view. I personally, because I've seen the effect of alcohol on people's lives, I understand why we felt that way. What makes us think all of a sudden that drinking alcohol is okay? So we won't say anything about that. We won't talk about cigarette smoking anymore. We dare not talk to people about sexual promiscuity. On and on and on we go. We try to soften the truth. I think we've done it because what we've done is gone from one extreme to the other. Rather than speaking the truth in love, we speak the truth with hatred. So now we've gone to the opposite extreme. We need to love so much that we don't tell anybody the truth. There's middle ground. Courage means that we stand for the truth, that we do what needs to be done, and we have no compunction, but we go ahead and do it anyway. So, as you think about it, think about again this unjust law. We could spend a little bit of time talking about that. There are a lot of laws in our society today that are unjust. So we really need to think about that when we think about this ideal of justice. Was this an unjust law? Absolutely. Did it need to be passed? Absolutely not. Should it have been done? Absolutely not. But it is what it is. So the reality is, again, we as God's people need to stand against unjust laws, unjust things that are wrong in and of themselves. Esther is being called to do this. She is in a position as a woman where she is putting her life literally on the line. And so again, the challenge is really there. And again, you see her fear. Think about as well what Mordecai says, if you remain completely silent at this time. has God given us these things now at this time in life so that we would stop being silent and start opening our mouths and doing what God wants us to do? God will find other ways to where relief and deliverance will be brought. We have not yet, in America, suffered unto blood, the Hebrew writer will talk about. And of course, back when he wrote it, he was writing to a different group of people, but the reality is he was still saying, you've not yet resisted unto blood. We haven't resisted unto blood, but will we remain silent? As I bring out this lesson, this just really hits home to me about how sometimes in the past I have been silent. I haven't opened my mouth and said what needed to be said. I have asked God to help me to speak out more, but I've also asked God that as I speak out, that I have more wisdom to say it in such a way where people will understand that I'm saying it out of love. So the challenge is there. So what does she do? She said this: go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast from me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Notice the New King James Version says, I will go to the king, which is against the law. So she's going to have to become a lawbreaker so that justice will be done. She saw the need for prayer. Before anything else happened, she begged for prayer and fasting. Prayer and fasting goes hand in hand throughout scriptures. A lot of times we study this back in Zechariah chapter 7. A lot of people would fast and they never really repent, and that's not what God wants either. But we realize that whenever we're very, very serious about something, that's when we do pray and that's when we do fast. When we lose somebody that we love, we a lot of times fast. We don't feel like eating because it's somebody that we love and we're just not hungry. Prayer is necessary. In the New Testament, before the beginning of the church, in Acts chapter 1 and 2, we read that for that period of 10 days, where Jesus had been ascended up into heaven, that period of time, they spent their time in prayer and fasting. They prayed and talked to God before the events of Acts chapter 2. I am firmly convinced that my prayers and the prayers of many that I hear in the Lord's church publicly show us how much we need to grow in this matter. We have to think about and meditate upon the idea, are our prayers as fervent and do our hearts really go into it as it needs to? With Esther and Mordecai and all the Jews at that time, they had to put heart, mind, soul, and strength in it because it meant their lives. Maybe we will never pray like that until our lives are in jeopardy or in danger. So again, it always emphasizes to me, Paul would continually talk about the importance of prayer in the life of the child of God. Here we have yet another example of it. We're going to see prayer in the life of Nehemiah. We're going to see prayer in the life here of Esther. We're going to see prayer in the life of Ezra. It is found throughout all the pages of Scripture. I'm firmly convinced that what we need to be doing is praying. Instead of having Bible studies about prayer and about how to pray, we need to be praying, because the way we learn to pray is by praying. We'll stop there for just a couple of minutes, and then we'll pick right back up. Esther 5 begins with the idea of the third day. Esther put on her royal robes, stood in the inner court of the king's palace across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne facing the entrance of the house, or facing the entrance of the idea there. And again, if you're reading from the Septuagint version, you read that there's a lot of extra details in verses 1 and 2 that we do not have written in our versions today. When the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she found favor in his sight. And I just want you to think about the idea that her heart must have been beating out of her chest. She probably was scared to death about what was going to be said and what was going to happen at that moment in time, whether or not she was going to be able to live or die. And so as you think about this, she was scared, but the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand, and she went near and touched the top of the scepter. So he is actually in court. This is surrounded by all of his advisors. And he said, "What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you up to half of the kingdom." Again, remember Matthew chapter 14, where again, this promise is made. It shows the king's beneficence, the fact that he is wanting those to come forward and do that. So she said, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him." And the king says, "Bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther said." So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And at the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition?" He knows that there must be something going on in her mind. He knows that she must be asking something. So he wants to make sure, what is it all about? "And it shall be granted to you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done." Now, isn't it interesting that and could this be the beginning of business meals as it was? I'm joking about that. But a lot of business meals, a lot of business is done at meals like this, where you eat with one another. It's at mealtime when you have this close fellowship, this close relationship with the people that you are spending that time with. So as you think about this is when a lot of decisions are made. He is now banqueting. He's getting everything whatever he desires. He's eating sumptuously. He's there before his beautiful queen. This queen has asked him to dinner. They're drinking wine again, as we're thinking about what happened back in chapter 1. So he's just really warm to the occasion, and whatever you want. And notice it shall be done there. That's how much he's fired up about it. So Esther said, "My petition and request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I have prepared for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king said." Why didn't she ask here now? Could it be what we might call buttering him up? Probably. Could it be a situation where she is wanting to make sure of what she wants to ask for? Though I'm sure she already asked. Could it be that she had been talking to Mordecai all through this situation, and now that she has this opportunity, she now has the opportunity to find out from Mordecai what he thinks needs to be done? But really, as you think about it, all of these things may have come into play. She wanted to butter him up again before he makes that final decision. So Haman went out that day joyful and with a glad heart. He had to know that he was a very special person, because only he was able to eat with the king and the queen together. And but when he saw Mordecai, that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was just burned up. All the happiness flew out of his heart. The pride that's going on in Haman's mind, what he thinks he deserves, and Haman not giving him that which he deserves. Did Mordecai know that Haman was the instigator of this? He probably did. But he still was not going to bow down and ask for forgiveness. He was not going to bow down and ask Haman to change the law. No, that was not his way. He was looking to God to solve this problem. So Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told him of his great riches. So he's bragging here. The multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, how he advanced him above all the officials and servants of the king. He's just bragging, talking about how God has, or not God, but how the king has blessed him. And he said, "You know what? Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared. And tomorrow I am again invited by her along with the king. He said, this is great, but yet all this avails me nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. I hate that man. I want him dead. And that's all I care about. All this other stuff that I've talked about, all the riches, all the glory, all the multitude of children, all the ways that I have been blessed, none of that amounts to a hill of beans to me. All I want is Mordecai dead. You know, sometimes we can get something, we can become like that. We can become so, have that tunnel vision so much that all we see is what we want to see, and we don't ever see anything else around us. We don't see the blessings that we have. Maybe we even go so far as Haman did to talk about those wonderful blessings, but what? We're not happy about it. We're not happy about it. Now think about, as you're looking at this, his rage against him. Esther, by asking him to this banquet, both this day and the next day, was laying a trap. Haman tries to lay a trap for Mordecai. So you see how all this thing is going to fall apart. Of course, we know the rest of the story, but as we look at it in detail, we've got to understand how it all falls apart. Galatians 6, verse 9. Whatsoever a man sows, that shall he also reap. If I am trying to do what I can to destroy somebody else, then I will reap the same if I am not very careful. So, what did he say? His wife and all his friends said, listen, let a gallows be made 50 cubits high. 50 cubits is about 75 feet. So it's not like he just wants a gallows made to hang Haman on. He wants a gallows made to hang Haman on and brought up 75 feet high to where everybody sees that Mordecai has been killed. Everybody sees how much Haman hated Mordecai and how he is going to be hung on that tree, hung as it was on that gallows, and be dishonored. He said, that's what I want to have happen. So he actually did it. So they're doing this. And in the morning, he said to suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it, then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. And obviously, he got a lot of workers in there, got it fixed, got it done just as quickly as they possibly could, making sure that this was ready to go whenever it happened. So the traps are laid. Esther for Haman, Haman for Mordecai. The best laid plans of mice and men don't always work. Who's going to win? We know how the story plays out. That night, the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the books of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. I often think about the same idea. Sometimes whenever we can't sleep at night, what we strive to do is read something that bores us so bad that we just got to go to sleep. And I can imagine that there is nothing more boring than the Chronicles of the King at that point in time, where they would start talking about all the people involved and all that happened and all the tax revenue brought in, all the stuff along that line. But again, you see God's providence, because what particular chronicle was brought in, what particular thing was done. So there it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And he said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And he said, nothing. They would have made a record of that as well. So it was just recorded, but nothing was done for him. And so the king said, well, who is in the court? And at that moment in time, again, it's not a situation of perfect timing. It is a situation of God's providence. At that moment in time, Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. That's why he was there that early in the morning. Accident? No way. Providence? Absolutely. And again, it works out that way. So the king's servant said to him, Haman is there standing in the court. Let him come in. He's my right-hand man. Let me hear what he's got to say. And Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done for the man whom the Lord king delights to honor? And he thought in his heart, the king can't want to honor anybody but me. Think again, this narcissistic attitude that is becoming an attitude of so many in America today. Why? I'm it. Do we not all, in a way, fight that feeling sometimes? We want the prestige. We want the honor. We want the respect. We want this. We want that. I think we all do. And so as we think about it and meditate on it, we've got to realize that, excuse me, as we think about it, we realize that this is where a lot of times we fall. Let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall, the Bible would say. So as we consider this fact, you can't help but realize he is so full of himself, so arrogant, that he can't think of anybody that the king would want to honor except him. How truly interesting is that? It's just amazing, is it not? So he said, and again, he's thinking about himself. He's saying, this is what I'd like to have happen to me. For the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. And let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor, and parade him on the horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. The king said to Haman, you know what, that sounds great. Do this. Take the robe and the horse, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. Notice that the king says Mordecai the Jew. Had he not remembered the edict, the decree he had set forth at that time? Doesn't say anything about it. Could there have been so much time going by that he'd forgotten about it? Possibly. Could it be that he could have cared, or he did not know what particular group, race of people there was? It doesn't seem like, as you go back again and see what Haman's specific request was, he just says that there are to annihilate all the Jews, chapter 3, verse 13. So obviously he did say to annihilate all the Jews, but now the king hadn't even thought more about it. So now he said, I want to honor Mordecai the Jew. That's interesting, is it not? So you do this for Mordecai the Jew, leave nothing undone in all that you have spoken. And because the king said it, Haman had no choice in the matter. He was one of the most noble of the princes. So Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on the horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done to the king, to the man whom the king delights to honor. And don't you know that his hatred and his vituperation was just coming out? He hated to do this, but he also knew that he was about to be humbled. He knew that things were not going to work out the way he wanted it to. He could not ask for the kings to give him Mordecai now, because Mordecai had done this for the king. There's no way in this world that the king would have commanded that Mordecai be put to death. So you see, everything is blowing up literally in his face. Let him who thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. And that is always a very real thing that every last one of us have to deal with. I think we all, in our heart of hearts, want to be honored. We like to be respected. We want people to give us the respect we think we deserve. And what we have to learn to do is to deny ourselves, to take up our cross and follow him. And that's exactly what we need to be doing. So as you think about it, this is something that he begins to realize what's happening. And afterward, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house mourning. He's just upset with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His wise men and his wife said, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you shall not prevail against him, but you will surely fall before him. And while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. Haman's trap failed. How's Esther's trap going to work out? So King and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day, at the banquet of wine, his heart's merry, he said, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done. If I have found favor in your sight, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. And he is mad. Who is he? Where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? And I could just see her pointing. The adversary and enemy is Haman. And Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Then the king rose up in your wrath and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. One of the great things that we can look at here is the idea of be sure that your sin will find you out. And think about how this is brought out over and over again. In Numbers chapter 34, verse 23 and 24, we read that Moses would say, but if you do not, then take note you have sinned against the Lord, and be sure your sin will find you out. There he was talking to the tribes that were not wanting to go with the children of Israel, or let me say this, that were wanting to settle on the east side of the Jordan River. And Moses misunderstood. And Moses thought that they were not going to help the other tribes to defeat them, to defeat the land of Canaan. He says, your sin will find you out. And that's true. How often have we maybe sometimes done something and thought maybe we could get away with it, lied or cheated or something along this line? Again, think about in Psalms 90, verse 7 through 9. We have been consumed by your anger, and by your wrath we are terrified. You have set our iniquities before you. God knows all. God knows everything. So that again helps us to understand that God, you know everything that we do. Our secret sins are in the light of your countenance. For all our days have passed away in your wrath. We finish our years like a sigh. And Psalms 90, most scholars believe, was written by Moses. So Moses would talk about their sins and what they have done up to that point in time. In Proverbs 13:21, evil pursues sinners, but to the righteous good shall be repaid. Why does evil pursue sinners? Their sin always finds them out. Isaiah 59, verse 12 through 15. Our transgressions are multiplied before you. Our sins testify against us. Our transgressions are with us. And for our iniquities, we know them in transgressing and lying against the Lord and departing from our God, speaking oppression and revolt, conceiving and uttering from the heart words of falsehood. Justice is turned back. Righteousness stands far off. Truth has fallen in the street. Equity cannot enter. So truth fails, and he who departs from evil makes himself a prey. In 1 Corinthians 4, verse 5, judge nothing before the time until the Lord comes, who will bring to light the hidden things of darkness and reveal the counsel of the hearts. Then each one's praise will come from God. You know, in this sometimes we have to do like Esther. Who is the enemy? Well, a story is told one time of a reporter who was interviewing an old man on his 100th birthday. He said, what are you most proud of? He said, well, I don't have an enemy in the world. And The reporter said, "What a beautiful thought, man. How inspirational." He said, and the old man said, "Yep, I've outlived every last one of them." You see, there's that. In Esther's case, it was very easy to identify her enemy. But sometimes it's not always easy to identify our enemies. As preachers, elders, deacons, as members of the church, we sometimes don't know that. And we've got to remember and think about people that we would not expect to become our enemies may very well become our enemies. We've also got to realize and remember what is motivating them to do that. And a lot of times it's not the people themselves, it's the one who's motivating them to do it, Satan. Remember what Jesus was saying, John 10:10, the thief comes not but to destroy and to steal and kill. I have come that they might have life, and they might have it more abundantly. Well, who was the one that motivates the thief to steal, kill, and destroy? It's Satan. He was saying, John 8:44, you are of your father, the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth. Peter will say, be sober, be vigilant, for your adversary, your enemy, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion. Sometimes we think somebody is an enemy when he's not. He's just being used by the enemy. Sometimes we need to know who the real enemy is. Satan will always keep us in turmoil. He will keep us from enjoying our relationship with God. He will keep you in turmoil. He will hound you day and night. He will fight you every step of your life. He will dog you without regard to who you are, what you do, how young or old you are, or how spiritually mature you are. You cannot escape this enemy. You cannot avoid him. You cannot hide from him, because sometimes our greatest enemy is us. We are the greatest enemy. And again, it's on the battlefield of our heart and mind that you fight your toughest battles. Will I surrender to God or not? Will I obey him or not? Will I answer his call or not? Will I choose purity or not? Will I forgive or not? Will I love or not? Sometimes the greatest enemy is ourselves. Will we hold to those bitter feelings? Will we get frustrated and say things out of anger? Well, it is. And so what do? What did Esther do? She turned her enemy over to the king. We need to turn our enemy over to the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. God knows what's going on. We may not. We cannot know everything that's going on. We cannot know everything God is doing behind the scenes. I think that may be part of the reason why God's name is not mentioned here in this book, because even though he's not mentioned, you can't help but realize he is behind the scenes working, orchestrating everything out. But nowhere does his name pop up or show up. Sometimes when we are in the thick of battle, when we are fighting our hardest, we wonder where God is. We do not know, but what has been happening up to this point in time and what's going to happen in the future, God has got us there for a reason, and God is at the same time preparing us for something a little later down the line. Don't sin because of your enemy. When you seek vengeance, you've fallen into sin. When you take justice into your own hands, you've fallen into sin. When wrath or strife or hatred becomes a part of your heart and you allow it to camp there, you've fallen into trouble that can't easily be gotten out of, because you've got to deal with that hatred. You've got to deal with that strife. You've got to deal with that enminess. And it's going to affect your relationship with God. It's going to affect your relationship with others. It's going to affect your relationship with yourself. So we need to make sure that our sin will find us out. We need to make sure we know who the real enemy is. We need to turn our enemy over to the king. We need to make sure that we are not going to commit sin because of our enemy. Chapter 7, verse 8, when the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Now, the king is not in the greatest of moods right now. And that was a very real understatement. But he says, will he also assault the queen while I am in the house? And the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, look, the gallows 50 cubits high, Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. And the king said, hang him on it. And they hung Haman on the gallows, which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's wrath subsided. So, on that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, and Esther had told how he was related to her. So the king took off the signet ring, and he gave it which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. And Esther again spoke before the king, fell down at his feet, implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman the Agagite. Keep hearing this phrase, the Agagite, again, think about this, and the scheme which he had devised. And the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, if it pleases the king, and if I found favor in his sight, and the king seems right to the king, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, which they wrote to annihilate the Jews. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? How can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen? And the king says, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hand on the Jews. You write the decree as you please in the king's name, seal it with the king's signet ring. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. So this brings up the idea. They were supposed to be annihilated, so that could not be revoked. So they now have to come up with a decree that does not revoke that decree, but also allows the Jews to live. And what was the solution? Giving them the opportunity to defend themselves. So the king's scribe were called at that time, the third month, the 23rd day. So this is third month. All the events that had taken place from the time of the decree in the 12th day of the first month to the situation where Haman was put to death, Mordecai now took about 2 months. So now they have a period of about 9 months to prepare. So that's what's happening. They get the word out the third month on the 23rd day. And it's written according to everything that Mordecai commanded in their script. And again, this part in verse 9 really emphasizes the decree, how it was supposed to go throughout all the provinces from India to Ethiopia, to every province in its script. Notice again, to Ethiopia. So all up through that time, every place that the Persian Empire had control over, this was supposed to be written to them. They sent it on swift steeds, and what did it say? The kings, by these letters, the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives. So in essence, the decree for them to annihilate the Jews still stands, but now the Jews have the right to protect their lives. And so again, they had the right to protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. So what in essence does this boil down to? They had a right to defend themselves. I want to stop right there because that might be a good place to stop, because when we start talking about the right to defend ourselves, we need to do some more study on this from the viewpoint of, do Christians today have the right to defend themselves? If an edict went out demanding that all the Christians today be killed, and there was another edict saying that of course what we would do is we would annul the law. We would say that was not it, should not be the case. But again, if you could not change it any other way, would Christians have a right to defend themselves in light of this? And I want to take for a few minutes and discuss that idea of Christian self-defense, look at it from a biblical viewpoint, and then what we will do is finish up the book of Esther and get on back to the book of Ezra. So that's my plan. That's our goal for this next week. I had hoped that we would go on from there and finish it all. But let's talk about this idea of self-defense for a little bit and then go on and discuss the Feast of Purim, and we will finish up. I want to thank you for attending this class. Thank you, Lance, for the great job that you do. Appreciate you. You encourage me in this respect, and I thank you for all you do in that respect. Keep on studying, brother, and let's keep up the good work for the glory of God. Thank you.